The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension, that strange metallic taste of anticipation that clung to the air before something irreversible happened. The faint hum of whispered speculation rolled like a low tide among the crowd, seated in the gallery. Every head turned when the heavy oak doors creaked open and Claire Lennox stepped in. She didn't rush, no. Her steps were deliberate, heels clicking a measured rhythm across the marble floor. The sound echoed against the vaulted ceiling, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. She wore a navy suit tailored to perfection, the kind that meant business but carried an undertone of elegance. Her hair, sleek and dark, was pulled back, not a strand out of place. Her face held a calm that wasn't born of serenity but of resolved quiet. Steady and unflinching, Daniel Lennox sat across the room, the very picture of power and wealth. His suit cost more than most people's yearly rent. His posture relaxed, like a man certain of his own invincibility. The gleam in his eyes was the same one Claire had seen countless times at galas, business meetings, and private dinners, the glint of a man who always thought he was the smartest in the room. Only, now she noticed, there was something else hiding just beneath the surface, a flicker, a crack. The faintest trace of worry. They hadn't seen each other since the night she left their penthouse, 2 weeks ago, without a word of explanation. She had been the perfect wife, on paper elegant, supportive, and never in the way of his ambitions. But in reality she had been a quiet observer, watching the small betrayals that grew into grander sins, cataloging every slight, every lie, every late-night business trip that ended with a perfume she didn't wear lingering on his shirt. For years she had tucked her suspicions into the corners of her mind like fragile things she didn't want to break open. Until one night she did. "Mrs. Lennox," the judge's voice pulled her out of the memory, steady and formal, "please take the stand." She walked with measured grace, the courtroom lights casting a soft sheen over the silver clasp of her briefcase. She could feel Daniel's eyes on her the entire time, a silent dare, as if he thought he could bend this moment to his will, like he bent everyone else. She placed the briefcase on the table beside her and sat down, folding her hands neatly. "Do you have evidence to support your claim?" The judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice even but carrying a subtle edge that made the room lean in. Her gaze swept the courtroom not hurriedly, but with the deliberate weight of someone who knew the moment they were in would be talked about long after it was over. "And I suggest everyone brace themselves." A ripple of curiosity surged through the gallery. A journalist's pen scratched faster across their notebook. A man in the back row leaned forward, unable to disguise his interest. Claire unclipped her briefcase, the metallic snap somehow sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. She pulled out a thin stack of neatly organized folders, each marked with a tab, each containing the kind of truth that could topple kingdoms. Across the aisle, Daniel shifted in his seat. He smiled, the kind of smile meant for cameras, reassuring, confident, but his fingers tapped against the armrest in a rhythm that betrayed him. Claire remembered the night she decided to act. The city outside their penthouse had glowed with the lights of skyscrapers and street lamps, but inside the glow had come from his phone screen. She'd caught the name in the corner of her eye, a name she didn't recognize, followed by words she couldn't unsee. His world had been built on control of the narrative, control of people, control of her. But that night she decided to rewrite the script. Now, here they were in a room where the weight of truth had nowhere to hide. The stakes weren't just personal, they were corporate, financial, and public. It wasn't just a marriage on trial, it was an empire. Claire handed the first folder to the clerk, her hand steady. The clerk passed it to the judge, who began to skim the contents. The moment stretched, every eye watching, every breath waiting. Daniel's jaw tightened by the smallest fraction. This was only the beginning, and Claire knew it. She hadn't come to this courtroom for half measures or polite confrontations. She had come to turn the page on a chapter he thought he owned. And, in her mind, the first sentence had already been written. "Would you like me to expand the next rising tension?" Section in the same rich cinematic style so it seamlessly continues the story. That's where the twist and emotional stakes will start to sharpen. The judge's eyes lingered on the documents in front of him, his brow tightening just enough to signal that whatever he was reading was not ordinary. The murmurs in the gallery swelled like a tide threatening to spill over until the gavel cracked. Once against the desk, silence. All that remained was the sound of the judge turning another page. The paper brushing softly against his fingers, Claire kept her gaze locked on Daniel. She wanted him to know she wasn't here to play the part he'd assigned her for years. She wasn't the silent partner anymore, the decorative wife who smiled on cue. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that half-second she saw the first sliver of recognition. He finally understood that she'd come prepared. The clerk began distributing copies of the evidence to the attorneys, and each page seemed to pull more air out of the room. Daniel's lawyer, a man with a face carved into practiced calm, flipped through the documents with increasing speed, his lips pressing into a hard, thin line. He leaned toward Daniel, whispering something sharp and urgent. Daniel didn't reply? His jaw just flexed once, and his eyes darted toward the exits before returning to Claire. The tension in the room wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, tightening coil, winding itself tighter with every heartbeat. Claire could feel it not just in the room, but in her own body. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but her breathing stayed even, controlled. She had trained herself for this moment. Every sleepless night in the weeks leading up to today, every hour spent combing through records, every calculated conversation with the right people, it had all been leading here. Your Honor, Daniel's lawyer finally said, his voice edged with restrained panic, we object to the admissibility of this so-called evidence. We have not had adequate time to review. Overruled, the judge said without looking up. His voice was quiet but left no room for argument. The gallery's whispers returned, this time sharper, electric. Someone's phone camera clicked. Claire didn't move, didn't smile. She wasn't going to gloat, not yet. The truth would do that for her, Mrs. Lennox, the judge said. Would you care to explain the contents of these documents for the record? Yes, Your Honor. She leaned slightly forward, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of something the room couldn't quite name, maybe fire, maybe ice. What you have in front of you is a record of wire transfers from offshore. Accounts tied directly to companies under my husband's control. Those companies on paper appear legitimate. In reality, they've been used to funnel corporate assets into personal accounts without shareholder approval. The gallery reacted, gasps. Shifting chairs, someone muttering, "Oh my God." Daniel's lawyer's face twitched, and his hand gripped his pen so tightly it looked like it might snap, but Claire wasn't finished. And that's just the financial side. The folders also contain correspondence, emails, text messages between my husband and certain government officials that show clear intent to manipulate contract bids in his favor. The dates, the amounts, the outcomes, they line up perfectly. The words hung in the air like a hammer before the drop. Every eye turned toward Daniel. He adjusted his cufflinks too casually, too quickly. The man who had once walked into boardrooms and bent them to his will with nothing but a smile was now sitting in a chair he didn't control, in a story he didn't own. The judge turned another page. His expression was unreadable, but the silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone. Mr. Lennox, he finally said, do you have any immediate response to these allegations? Daniel's voice was smooth, practiced. Your Honor, these claims are not only false, they are an orchestrated attempt to damage my reputation. My wife, he put just enough emphasis on the word to imply betrayal, has a personal vendetta against me, and she's willing to twist facts to serve her own ends. The words were polished, but they didn't carry the same weight they once might have. Because Claire had done more than bring paper. She had brought timing, she had brought precision, and she had brought a truth that didn't shake easily under denial. As the lawyers began to spar over admissibility, jurisdiction, and timelines, the tension in the room shifted again, not a release, but a new strain. Every exchange was a push and pull between control and collapse. Claire stayed still, her hands folded neatly, her breathing slow. She knew the game they were playing, and she had already mapped out the next 10 moves. A sudden clap of thunder rolled outside, startling a few in the gallery. Rain began to lash against the high courtroom windows, streaking the glass. It was as if the weather had been holding its breath and finally let go. The storm outside mirrored the one inside, both inevitable, both unstoppable. Daniel leaned toward his lawyer again, whispering fiercely now. His lawyer nodded, scribbling something onto a yellow legal pad before sliding it toward the judge. The judge glanced at it, then set it aside without comment. Daniel's fingers drummed a quick, erratic rhythm on the table. Claire noticed it. She always noticed the small tells, the signs he was fraying, even when no one else could see. Years of living with him had taught her the micro-signals, the way his jaw set before he lied, the slight squint when he calculated, the tapping fingers when he felt cornered. And right now he was cornered. The court clerk began setting up a projector, and Claire knew what was coming next. She had insisted on it during the pretrial motions. The evidence would not just be words on paper. It would be seen, displayed in front of everyone, frame by frame. When the first image appeared on the screen, a bank statement with Daniel's signature, the collective energy in the room shifted again. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't rumor. This was undeniable. The lawyer for the prosecution began to walk the court through each piece, the pointing, the circling of dates and amounts, the connecting of dots that painted a picture so clear it couldn't be ignored. Daniel sat back in his chair, his face tight, but his eyes darted to the gallery, scanning for familiar faces. He was no longer performing for the judge, he was searching for allies, for anyone who still believed the version of himself he had built. The tension was now a living thing in the room, thick enough to touch. And Claire knew it wouldn't break, not yet. The real snap would come when the final piece fell into place, and she had saved the sharpest blade for last. If you want, I can make the climax section even more intense by pushing the emotional confrontation between Claire and Daniel to its breaking point while still keeping that cinematic pacing. This is where the room stops breathing entirely. The courtroom was silent except for the ticking of the antique clock mounted high above the judge's bench. The final words of her testimony still hung in the air like a blade suspended over her husband's world. Claire stood there, calm yet unyielding, her voice having sliced through the web of lies he had so carefully spun for years. Across the aisle, Jonathan's confident smirk had long since dissolved, replaced by the pale look of a man realizing the walls were closing in. The evidence she'd presented, a series of damning messages, financial transfers to a mistress, and even a private investigator's photographs, had turned the court into an execution ground for his reputation. The judge's gavel struck once, sealing the verdict on the divorce settlement. The terms were staggering. Jonathan's assets would be divided heavily in Claire's favor. His position as CEO now under review by the board due to his scandal, and his once spotless public image shattered beyond repair. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse, reporters shouting questions. But Claire walked through them with the grace of someone who had already won the war before the first shot was fired. The whispers followed her. She destroyed him. She's going to be rich now. Did you hear the board's meeting tonight? But Claire wasn't listening for gossip. She was focused on what came next. That evening, in the towering glass headquarters of Titan Global, the boardroom was electric with tension. The executives sat stiffly, the long mahogany table reflecting the sterile glow of the city lights. Jonathan had been summoned, but he arrived late, the arrogance in his stride replaced with a limp weariness. His mistress was gone, his allies scarce, and the board had grown restless with his reckless leadership and the PR nightmare he had become. One by one, voices rose against him, citing breach of ethics, damaged shareholder trust, and questionable financial decisions. The vote was swift. Jonathan was ousted. He didn't look at Claire when it was announced, though he knew she was the one who had started the dominoes falling. When the chair turned toward her and the board's president said, "Claire, we believe you're the right person to lead us into the next chapter," the room seemed to pause. Every pair of eyes shifted to her. She had not expected this, not exactly. She had wanted justice, freedom, and closure, but the universe had handed her something more: power. She accepted, her voice steady, her mind already racing through the changes she would make. The cameras would soon catch wind of it. Ex-wife takes over as CEO of disgraced billionaire's company. The irony would be savored by millions. Jonathan watched her from the doorway as she signed the official documents. He had never seen her this way, commanding, radiant, untouchable. His mouth twitched as if to speak, but no words came. In that silence, Claire saw the man who had once charmed her, lied to her, and underestimated her. But she felt no need for revenge anymore. Karma had already done its work. That night, standing in her new office on the top floor, Claire looked out over the glittering city skyline. She thought of the nights she had cried herself to sleep, the humiliation of betrayal, the weight of secrecy she had carried. All of it had led here. The desk in front of her, Jonathan's old desk, was now hers. The pen that signed her marriage papers had also signed her divorce, and now it signed her future. The door opened slightly, and her assistant poked her head in. "The press is waiting, ma'am. They want to know how it feels to be CEO." Claire smiled, not out of arrogance, but from the deep satisfaction of knowing she had survived the fire and emerged stronger. She straightened her jacket, walked to the elevator, and stepped into the blinding lights. "Tell them," she said, "that sometimes losing everything is how you gain it all." And somewhere, in the shadows of his empty penthouse, Jonathan poured himself another drink. His reflection in the glass, looking back at him with the truth he could no longer escape. He had built his empire on deceit, and it had been taken from him by the one person he thought he had broken. But she wasn't broken. She was the boss now. And she would never be the same woman he betrayed.